Towers in New York City on September 11, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is a 9/11 Free Fall, everybody. Hello, I'm Bernie Suarez, and I'm back, and I'm here with Andrew Steele. I'm very glad to be back, and we are coming to you on the internet and around the world via NoLiesRadio.org every Thursday night, 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern. And you can also listen to 9/11 Free Fall. We're available all around the internet and all around the world on 911freefall.com. This is a website where you can log on and listen to any one of our previous shows. That's right, and get a full load of truth. Amazing. Hi, everybody, again, and welcome to 9/11 Free Fall. This radio show is committed from back to front to 9/11 truth. We are committed to the scientific evidence surrounding the events of 9/11, committed to exposing the official story, which has more holes in it than Swiss cheese, people. And we are very committed to bringing attention to organizations that focus on the science and the truth of 9/11, particularly organizations like Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which can be found at ae911truth.org. Well, here we are. It's been a while, Andy. I am quite excited to be here with you today, and I can't say enough. How are you doing today, Andy?
Bernie, I'm fired up as always. I'm happy to have you back on the show, and I'm happy because we are doing our last show of the year 2012 with a great guest today, and I can't believe we've been at this since June, okay? That's 7 months, folks. Week after week, we've been answering the bell and refusing to let this issue be forgotten, okay? Refusing to let the crime of the century get buried underneath the feet of a bought and paid for media and the government unofficials, as I like to call them. Right. These people who they fear people like you and me, Bernie, and they fear people like our audience who know what's really happening are doing something about it. You know, and it's funny too. There was this silliness earlier in the week about the world ending, and of course that was total nonsense. But the real news is that the world is not ending, but that it's awakening, and all of you out there in the audience are part of that awakening happening right now.
Absolutely, and thank you for pointing that out. This is the last show of the year, so I'm even that much more excited to be rejoining you on this show. And yeah, we are still here, despite the end of the Mayan calendar and all this end of the world stuff, and voila, we're still here. And so is 9/11 Truth. And I'm here. I have someone with me who has campaigned with me at the streets here in L.A., and when we hand people information about the truth of 9/11, and one of the signs we had up one time just simply said, because 9/11 truth is forever, and people see these documents and flyers and posters and whatever banners talking about 9/11 truth, and they wishfully think that 9/11 truth is going to go away. And as you just pointed out, it's not going to go away, and it's not going to go away because of the work of people like our guest today, work that is forever, truth, reproducible science. And speaking of reproducible science, we're going to be talking about reproduction of science today, and our guest and what's going on with his work, and talk about reproducing experiments and all that. So we'll get to that in a second. We're going to start off for our audience with 10 seconds of silence to commemorate the victims of 9/11, with not only the people who died on 9/11, but a lot of us who have had to endure 11 years of post-9/11, a world filled with all kinds of decisions. We talk about endless wars, and I could go on and on. Crimes all over the world, all in the name of 9/11 and the events of that day and the lies surrounding that day. So we're going to remember all the victims right here. We're going to do 10 seconds of silence beginning right now. All right, and with that, that's 10 seconds. There you go, people. We don't do this for attention, to get ratings. I don't think that's ever gotten us any ratings, right, Andy? We do this simply to keep us focused on why we do this show and why we have the guests that we have on, and why we keep hammering away at this story that is being told, the story of truth about 9/11 that I assure you, Andy, and you know this, will be told by many, many generations generations to come will echo this truth of 9/11 that we have all, as a group, have sown the seeds of in this generation as we were alive when this event happened, and we will make sure that the future generations know exactly what happened on that day. So we keep ourselves focused for that reason. So, all right, well, moving on, Andy, there's a couple things going on. I had a brief chance to kind of go over some 9/11 related events going on, and AE 9/11 Truth is always a good place to go to for that. And what can we say? I know we have this incredible 3-part international conference going on in Malaysia, and I know we had some representatives, Richard Gage, up back there a month ago or so, and that's a great thing for the 9/11 Truth movement. That's very important. You want to fill in some other events and things that are going on?
Yeah, and we talked about the Malaysian conference a few weeks ago, and I love that they talk about pursuing, a legal path for it. That's where our discussion needs to be. That's where we need to be focused. I also want to point our audience to an article currently on AE911truth.org titled "Dubai Skyscraper Engulfed in Flames Does Not Collapse." And if you go there, you're going to see a picture of a tall steel frame building that's on fire, and you'll read about the aftermath of that fire, which is that it didn't fall down like World Trade Center 7 did. Yes, of course, no plane hit this building in the UAE, but no plane hit World Trade Center Building 7 either. So apparently the laws of physics only apply to buildings not owned by Larry Silverstein. And this is yet another example of real life debunking the psyop that we witnessed on September 11th. So let me just read a quick excerpt from the article. It begins, "A high-rise building catches fire in a major city. All of its occupants are evacuated as fire crews arrive to put out the blaze. After a few hours, the flames spread across dozens of floors, and in the end, the building remained standing." That was the story last month in Dubai, the most populous city in the United Arab Emirates, as the Tom Wheel building was added to the long list of steel-framed skyscrapers that have withstood major fires. This stark contrast to the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7, the only skyscrapers in history whose complete collapses have been officially blamed on fire, is causing more people to question the official 9/11 story. Even though the massive fire charred large portions of the Tom Wheel building, the skyscraper still stands today. The fire in the Tom Wheel building sent flames across all 34 stories of the high-rise, according to the local newspaper, with the largest flames appearing at the top floors. The blaze lasted for more than 5 hours before it was extinguished. Conversely, the National Institute of Standards and Technology claims that fires destroyed the Twin Towers in less than 2 hours on 9/11. So the author of this article goes on to reference an article published by AE911truth.org back in 2010 that listed a number of other steel-framed high-rise buildings that have caught on fire and didn't collapse. And among them are the Empire State Building in 1945, One New York Plaza in 1970, the North Tower of the World Trade Center in 1975, the First Interstate Bank in 1988, One Meridian Plaza in Philly in 1991, the Park Central East Tower in Caracas, Venezuela in 2004, and the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing, China in 2009. So right now, as the article states, you can add the Tom Wheel building in the UAE to that list. All right, and of course, if you actually do a search through history, you will see that there is no case of a steel frame high-rise completely collapsing because of fire like you saw on 9/11. That's because it can't. All right, that doesn't happen. All the scientific evidence points to explosives, not fires, bringing the Twin Towers in Building 7 down, but that doesn't fall in line with the story we're told we have to swallow, and in which the press isn't going to go into any deeper than trying to attack us for pointing out these facts. So we got to be the media ourselves, and our audience needs to help us spread this info by copying and pasting articles like the one I'm reading from off of AE911truth.org into their blogs, by embedding the show into their blogs, by telling others to check it out, and being that voice of truth out there, because the truth is not going to come to light unless we act as the media ourselves, unless we be those modern-day Paul Revere's getting the word out. As well, if you go to 9/11 Blogger this week, they have a video put up by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. It was for a college event that Richard Gage was unable to attend because of what he was doing in Malaysia. It was originally videotaped or produced, I guess, December 15th. But, it's a presentation for the college students. But I love that in the beginning he talks about the loss of civil liberties, and he shows video of protesters being maced. And he asks this question is, have you ever trusted someone completely and found out they were lying to you? Okay, and I think all of us, no matter who you are, where you've lived, or, what kind of life you've had, we can all say that we've had. It's a part of life, okay? And so now you apply this to the question of 9/11. We grow up trusting our government. We're taught to trust and believe what they tell us, especially as something as important as 9/11. But now as we're finding out, some of us quicker than others, we were lied to. If you go to 9/11 Blogger, you see that video put up by AE 9/11 Truth, and Richard talks about some of the evidence. But that is a question that we need to be asking ourselves, because if we can be lied to and trust somebody and be lied to that time, could it happen on a bigger scale?
Well, that's exciting news for me. I'm very adamant about the importance of educating the college kids. And I get to have, I'm always, one of the jobs that I work, I get a chance to be around college kids a lot. And I can't tell you how saddening it is to see these kids eating up these mainstream media lies, and how important it is to reach out to the college audience. The importance of it, I cannot underscore. So that is
Absolutely.
Really important.
And that's why, a couple of weeks ago, we had Steve Cohn and Mike Figa on here to talk about college outreach. And God bless those people, the people out there doing that kind of work, because those are the people that are going to make a difference and plant the seeds for the future. Absolutely.
And I guess there's also, I guess it's perhaps tied to what you're saying, some college, there's a nice article on ae911truth.org about the College Speaking Project Takes Off.
Well, that's correct. Yeah, this is about the NACA. I say NACA. It's NACA conference that AE 9/11 Truth was a part of, and it's all part of that drive. Steve Cohn is the head of the college outreach team. He's based out there in Arizona, but AE 9/11 Truth outreach goes nationwide, and this audience can be a part of that. We've talked about on this show before about how they can join the team at AE 9/11 Truth. Just go to ae911truth.org, and there's a home for every kind of genius out there. No matter what you're good at, there's a place for you in a way that you can contribute to this fight, and college outreach is one of those ways.
Right. There you go, people, and everyone can keep track of what's going on. There's a lot of websites. You mentioned 9/11 Blogger, and there's also, as we always mention, AE 9/11 Truth. We will post. We constantly are posting new things here on 911freefall.com as well. So we just want everyone to know that this 9/11 Truth movement is not going to go away, and we encourage them to be a part of it. And if you're one of those people that is still on the fence, well, things are only getting worse. And as we've talked about, Andy, almost everything going on can be traced back to this one event. And it's just not going to go away. People need to wake up to what happened on that day. But we'll see how things work out in this coming year. And I believe that with every single day that goes by, more and more people, everywhere I go at least, are realizing that it really didn't happen the way the media. I think there's a loss of confidence in the media right now, that people realize they're just not being told the truth.
You're absolutely right, Bernie, and it's funny, this is why you need to speak out. Quick story, the other day I ran over a nail with my tire, so I had a flat tire when I got out of work, so I had to make an emergency visit after I got the donut onto Pep Boy, so I'm sitting there waiting for him to put my new tire on, and there's a guy who's watching the news, and I can recognize that face now, so that face that somebody makes when they're watching news and they're about ready to bust out of their skin. They just want to talk to someone, so we just started chatting and everything. I mean, he was a fully awakened 9/11 truth person. And then while we're talking, these two college students come in who are going to a college that's nearby us, and they were awakened too. It's amazing how many people are awakened to this topic. We just need people to be talking out loud and unafraid to talk out loud. Have loud conversations about this, and you'll be amazed at the crowds that will get together. And that's the start of change right there.
And that's it. People, the establishment wants everyone to think that you're going to be left out and you're going to be the oddball by standing for the truth. But you and I know better than that. We talk about this all the time on the show. It's just that perception that they want to put out, that if you do stand for truth, you don't want, you're going to be considered a conspiracy theorist and all that. That is a paradigm that is out with the 2012, and with this new year, we have a new paradigm in our hands. We've been acting on this paradigm for a while as standing for truth, and I just feel very empowered right now, Andy. That's what we're doing. And telling somebody the other day that change begins within you, and not with Barack Obama, not with any politician or any presidential administration. The change begins right here, right now, inside of you people listening to this show. The evidence is very rock solid, and that's why we do this show. We're going to get to the evidence, and we're going to get to our guest in a second, speaking of evidence. Well, moving on, Andy, I want to throw out a question of the week. Do we have enough evidence for a criminal conviction right now when it comes to 9/11 truth? Do we? I could hear the voices right now. A lot of people saying yes, and others maybe saying, oh, how dare we ask that question, right? Well, I think we should ask the question. It's a good question. And after this show today, a lot of people may see why. I think that we do have enough evidence, and I think I'll put myself on the line and say that. What do you think, Andy?
Well, I absolutely do, and our audience will listen to the show and listen to our guests in a few minutes, and they will hear what the evidence is and what is the smoking gun evidence. Obviously you have Building 7. Just watching that building fall, you have to know that there's a problem with it. So, for lack of a specific person who was responsible for the event, that obviously needs to be found out. There is ample evidence to call for a new congressional committee to investigate this. But the problem is we're still running into the obstacles we're always running into, and so the problem isn't even in evidence. The problem is that the barriers, the system. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're overcoming by doing this show and by bringing guests on like the guests we have today.
That's exactly. Okay, so let's move on to our guests. The first thing I want to put out there for our audience, because we have a wide range of audience, and within our audience, we don't know what people are familiar with. So before we get into our guest today, I want to remind our audience that in the scientific field of metallurgy, it's a scientific field. It's a domain of material science, and I'm just reading this from a standard site here. Metallurgy is a domain of material science that studies the physical and chemical behavior of metallic elements, their intermetallic compounds, and their mixtures, which are called alloys. It is also the technology of metals, the way in which science is applied to their practical use. Metallurgy is distinguished from the craft of metalworking. Metallurgy is usually studied as a subset of material science with a mechanical engineering degree or manufacturing engineering degree. Now, I just wanted to throw that out there so our audience can appreciate our guest today, whose name is Mark Basile, and he has a bachelor in chemical engineering from Worcester Polytech Institute in 1985. He has indeed worked in the industry for 30 plus years, and the last 13 years has been designing and doing proof of principle experiments on new optical-based detectors, such as UV absorbance, fluorescence, and refractive index. Mark Basile has been a pioneer of the truth movement when it comes to the hard evidence and the science. I personally view him as one of the most sincere and serious scientists in the field of 9/11 science. I watched some of his previous videos, and he is so good at explaining why he's doing what he's doing and what he is doing. He's very systematic and very careful with his words. I appreciate all his work. Without getting into any more coloring up or anything, I want to introduce Mark Basile. Hi, Mark. Thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
What I'm going to ask you very quickly, if you don't mind, just for the sake of our audience, can you just kind of briefly explain to the audience when you got involved in 9/11 Truth and maybe how you got involved?
Well, really a few things. I mean, it was a gradual, step-by-step kind of thing, but I really had some questions about the whole thing kind of from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. But I basically just started, paying attention online on the Internet, and pretty quickly became aware of some of the early work that Stephen Jones and company were doing. And he actually came to Boston. I live just an hour north of Boston, basically. He came to Boston back in December of 2007. There was a conference sponsored by one of the Boston 9/11 groups. It was held in a facility called Faneuil Hall here in Boston. And so I knew Stephen Jones was coming to talk about his work with the microspheres at that point. It was really what he had found in there, along with other people, including the U.S. Geological Survey that did a lot of work on the dust. And a number of different groups were seeing these iron-based microspheres in the dust. And that concerned me because I really wouldn't have expected to see huge amounts of those within the dust. I mean, there might have been a few here, there, whatever, but not to the quantities that were being seen in the dust. So anyway, he came to Boston in 2007. Or December of 2007. So I went in to listen to what he had to say, along with some other speakers that were there for the conference. And so anyway, he got up and talked about the microspheres, and as he was speaking, he says, I'm going to announce something that I haven't, really spoken about before. And he began to talk about what we call these days the red-gray chips, which are what we originally called this material that appears to be nanothermite. And so he basically just started explaining what he had found in there and some of the properties that they had and so on. And so I approached him really afterwards. I got up and asked a couple of questions after his speech or during his speech, I forget exactly. But the real point was that after he was done, I approached him and I said, a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, I have the capability to do some of that on my own, and I'd really be interested in being put in touch with a sample of the dust to take a look at it myself independently. And he followed up a couple of weeks later and put me in touch with a woman by the name of Jeanette McKinley, which is one of the 4 samples of dust that was used in the article that he and the others that he worked with published back around shortly after that type of time frame. I think it was around 2009 or so, early 2009 they published. And so really that's kind of when I first started really getting involved in the dust itself. I mean, I was doing some reading and learning up to that point, but an actual hands-on began basically around January of 2008.
Very interesting. And I've seen some of your interviews. You really took a scientific approach. You were aware that your work could possibly have resulted in perhaps debunking Stephen Jones's work, or contradicting, or perhaps disproving what he had shown. You just approached it with a purely scientific approach to see what comes out, and correct? And with regard to whether the chips release the energy, you want to speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, in his article, I mean, they had access to a machine called a differential scanning calorimeter, and basically what that does is it has the ability to monitor energy flow in and out of things. So, like, for instance, when ice melts, energy has to go into it to melt it, to bring its temperature up. But when something melts, well, that's an example of melting, but But in the opposite way, for instance, if I ignite a firecracker, energy comes out of that. And so it shows up as an energy release in the instrument. And basically you get a peak that goes up or you get a peak that goes down based on whether the heat flow is going in or out. But basically what they saw in the DSC was a very sharp, what's called an exotherm. That means energy is coming out of the reaction instead of going into it. And that happens a little above 400 degrees centigrade. I don't have access to a DSC at this point. But I have conducted independent experiments where I basically can put the chips onto a heater strip and bring them up to a controlled temperature and then watch to see if a reaction occurs. And I've seen in a number of different chips where basically when you bring them up to that temperature, they ignite. They burn. There's a white flame that goes on inside of the chip. You can actually see the light coming through the chip as it's consumed. But basically, the real key thing is that when you open up the chip, what you find inside is that the chip's chemical reaction that's occurred inside there once it's been initiated at a little above 400 degrees centigrade is that it's produced molten iron inside of the chip. There's iron droplets and there's actually iron films that get produced all through the remaining matrix once the chemical reaction has occurred. If you cut these chips up and look inside of them beforehand, there's no iron sphere. There's no iron films or anything like that. The iron basically only gets produced after the chemical reaction. So these chips have the capability of producing about 1,500 to 2,000 degrees centigrade inside and producing molten irons.
Amazing. And despite all that, we still have these shills out there that want to suggest that these are paint chips. What is your response to that with these different individuals?
Well, I've been supplied with a sample of. I've been supplied with a sample of. From what I understand, there may have been actually 2 different primers used within the construction of the World Trade Center. I've been supplied with one of them. And I've put it through the exact same test, and it doesn't produce iron spheres. Basically, all it does is it turns into, in large part, glass fibers and a bunch of minerals and so on. But there's no iron spheres or iron films or anything that get produced from the one primer that I've put through the exact same experiments. And I wouldn't expect any paint to do that. I've also put a number of different paints that I basically have just from my house. They're not, World Trade Center primer paint or anything, but they're just paints. And just to see for myself to, again, run another experiment, I wouldn't expect them to produce molten iron, and they didn't. You wouldn't expect any paint that you would paint onto any building that when it caught on fire to produce molten iron. If it did, you wouldn't use it to paint your building. You just wouldn't do it. I wouldn't anyway. I don't think anybody in their right mind would insure your building if it did.
Very well said, and thank you. Appreciate for that work. But you know what? Andy and I talk about it all. That doesn't stop these individuals out there from putting out this disinformation and saying that these are nothing more than paint chips that were found. So we just wanted to.
There are a lot of paint chips in the dust. You should make that perfectly clear. Just when if anybody in the audience, let's say, were to go out and get a World Trade Center dust sample and they pull out red chips from this, I'm not telling anybody in the world that every red chip you're going to pull out of there is one of these nanothermite chips. The vast majority of them actually are primer paint from what I'm finding. But that doesn't mean that they all are. And they're not all because, like I said, I've pulled out ones where I've seen the reaction and I've seen the product. So I know they're in there. But there's also a lot of primer paint chips in there too.
Right. Has there been any work isolated to illustrate? I know you mentioned you've done a lot of this. for someone who doubts, who wants to keep going with the paint chip theory, work side-by-side work with the paint chips versus the thermite chips?
I think some of the chips that, Jones and all looked at were definitely, primer paint chips too. So, not everything in there was necessarily a nanothermite chip, but there were chips that gave this exotherm. And that's the real key thing, is you get this extreme exotherm at just a little above 400 degrees centigrade, and it produces molten iron as a reaction product.
Well, for our audience, we're speaking with Mark Basile, a chemical engineer expert who has been working for some time with 9/11 World Trade Center dust samples, and is well established. Mark, we're going to talk about your work. You're coming up with some new work, and we want to mention what you're doing and your website in a second. Andy, do you have any specific questions before we move on with Mark's work that he's doing now?
Sure. Well, I love that you brought up skeptics or debunkers, and Mark, I just want to know, what about people who say that thermite couldn't have been used to bring down the buildings? I mean, well, first of all, what about that? And also, can you address about the thermite itself? Is this normal thermite?
Well, it's not normal thermite, no, but I mean, it has the same basic characteristic that it produces a lot of energy, in essence, is what it's produced for. I mean, a thermite was originally produced for producing molten iron, in essence. It was used, one of its major things was for welding steel rails together, like railroad rails. They would, in essence, build a crucible over the steel rails, fill it with thermite, ignite it, and then there'd be a little trap door on the bottom of the crucible that once the crucible is filled with molten iron, they could open up the sluice door, let the iron down, weld the tracks together, and then grind it to final form again. So its basic thing is to produce molten iron or molten metal. You can do it with different metals. The traditional thermite produces molten iron. But no, this is, in essence, all they've really done is taken the aluminum and the iron oxide. Those are the two things that go together in traditional thermite. And they've put them into, in essence, nano-size scale. And what that does is it really just creates a lot more surface area so that when the reaction does proceed, it can spread and progress much more rapidly. It's the same as like if you make gunpowder. You can, mix the basic ingredients together and you'll get a fire. But if you grind them together until they're as fine as in flour, you'll get a much more robust burn and a much more aggressive type of action. So it's really analogous to that type of thing. You can play with the kinetics, in essence, how fast the reaction proceeds by getting the particles small enough. The other thing that they can really do with it, though, and that's where I think they get the impulse energy out of the thermite, because thermite isn't explosive. It's not an explosive. It doesn't produce any explosive impulse whatsoever. But if you were to put it into combination with something that does produce gas when it's heated up, for instance, even just water. Water produces steam. You know how they actually launch fighter jets off of the decks of battleships? They use steam. It's actually a steam-fired cylinder down below the deck there that slingshots that thing off. And so if you were to take, for instance, thermite and put it in contact with a sufficient quantity of water, it could basically turn that water into steam within a very, very short period of time and produces an explosive event. I happen to be watching Mythbusters one day. It's a good little show, shows you a lot of, basic stuff. And I think those guys used to basically work in the stunts industry. And one day they were doing a show where they were talking about thermite. And they said, yeah, but thermite can really move stuff. And basically all they did was they took a big bag of thermite, normal thermite. Okay, so it wouldn't burn as fast as nanothermite. But all they did was they laid it on top of a big slab of ice, and they lit it. And they had it was a frail little building that they built around this thing. But basically what happened here was that as the thermite began to react, it produced, copious amounts of heat, and it basically transformed a significant piece of that ice block into steam, in a very short period of time, and it blew that little shack to bits. So, yes, you can produce an overpressure using thermite, would be my contention. If you were to put it into close proximity with something that can produce large amounts of vapor, when it gets heated sufficiently, you can produce an overpressure or produce work, in essence, an explosive work using thermite. But traditional thermite would not be used as an explosive, but if it was mixed properly with the right materials, it could do that, yes.
Well, now, you said that in one of your videos that a distinguishing characteristic is the nano-aluminum. Now, if I want to get some of this nano-aluminum, how do I make it, or how do I buy nano-aluminum?
It can be bought, but from what I understand, it's a controlled substance. So you would be restricted in how much you could buy, and your use of it would be watched, in essence, to a degree. I'm sure there's ways to make it. I haven't looked up how to do that. But
is that because of the nano size that it'd be so controlled and watched over?
Well, I think it's just because it's so reactive. It has the potential to be a nasty little material. It's the same as like dynamite. I mean, you can go buy dynamite if you get a license, and you've been checked out to be okay with it. In essence, it's the same with a lot of materials. But you wouldn't normally just be able to walk into a hardware store and say, "Oh, I'll take 100 pounds of nano aluminum." It's just not going to happen.
Well, thank you, Mark, for explaining a lot of that. I've heard debates even within so-called truthers debating whether a thermite is explosive or an explosive or not. And you really explained that very well on how it can have that property depending on how it's mixed and all that. Even, I'm not a chemical engineer, but I'm learning a lot just hearing you talk about it right now. I understand it can have explosive properties, but what you call it, it's not considered an explosive, as incendiary. Correct?
But the other way I guess I'd try to explain it would be, let's say I had a liter or a gallon, whichever one you want to choose, of gasoline or aviation fuel, right? That's what's on the jets, aviation fuel. And you had a liter or a gallon, same quantity, of thermite. They basically have, I think, comparable amounts of energy on a volume for volume or mass per mass basis. There may be a 4x difference between them, but it's not, like hundreds of times. But the thing is you can take that container of thermite and completely burn it up and release all of its energy in probably a tenth of a second. You're not going to do the same thing with a gallon of gasoline. You're not going to burn it up and release all its energy in a tenth of a second. So what you've done in doing that in a tenth of a second or even shorter is taken all of that incredible amount of energy, and now you can use it to produce gas or whatever it is that you want to do, or cut through steel. You pick your choice of what you want to do with that energy. You can't necessarily do both, but you can do one or the other, or a little bit of both. But you've got a lot of energy there. That's the real thing. You've got a lot of energy there, and you can get it out of it really quick.
Very, very interesting. You have you proposed a study, and we want to point our audience that they can go, Basile.org, MarkBasile.org, and they can see what you're trying to do. Why don't you tell us about your proposed study?
Well, basically, all I'm really trying to do here is, in large part, duplicate the work that's been done already by Jones and Harrod and the rest of the individuals, Ryan and Farrar, that worked on the original study. I want to reproduce that. That's the first step, really, is to just say, yep, I see the same thing, or no, I see something different, although I've already seen similar things, like I've said. But the other thing is to take it a little bit further and use a couple of techniques that they didn't use at the time. One of the things that they had wanted to try to accomplish, or I understand people want to see, is to prove actually that there's free elemental aluminum within the chips. And so one of the techniques that's proposed to be used is some Esca and Auger techniques that basically will allow us to determine if there's some elemental aluminum. The other approach is to do some of these DSC runs, these calorimeter runs, but to do them in an inert gas atmosphere. Now, a number of people have claimed that the thermite will ignite in an inert atmosphere. And I think it will. I'm just not sure that it's going to ignite at the same temperature as when there's air present. The activation energies involved may be different in an inert atmosphere versus one where there's oxygen. But if it doesn't ignite in an inert atmosphere, one thing that should happen when we hit the melting point of aluminum, if it hasn't ignited by that point, is we would actually detect the melting point and the melting energy of any free aluminum that was actually present in the chips. So there's a couple of different techniques that are being proposed to try and discern whether there's actually elemental aluminum within the chips. That's one of the key differences. And other than that, it's really just trying to reproduce what's been done before.
And this is a blind study that you're doing. We had Rick Shattuck on a few weeks ago to talk a little bit about this. But what you're looking to do right now is raise some money to, I think it's $5,000. You got a little thermometer on your site here, to raise the money to do what is a blind study. And can you reiterate for our audience what that is and what the significance of doing a quote-unquote blind study on the dust is?
Well, I think the key thing is, it removes a bias. But the only reason I'm doing it is I do that anytime I use an outside lab. I don't go into the outside lab and say, here, look at this. This is what you find. If I tell them what I expect to find, then I'm biasing them. And so really, anytime I bring anything to anybody, I just tell them, go look at this, and, I wait for them to tell me what they find. Or in a lot of cases, I actually work with them, but I'm not telling them what to find there. I'm just letting them go off and do the analysis that I've asked them to do and to report back to me what it is that they find. And that's really all I'm looking to do, is supply some material to these labs, have them run some standard analytical tests, and give me the results. It doesn't matter to them what the sample is. They're just going to tell me what they find.
And how is it different from the studies you've done before?
Well, the only real difference would be that it would be somebody else that was actually running the equipment and somebody else that would actually be coming up with the results rather than me simply saying, this is what I found. It's totally independent scientists running an assay and just giving a result. So.
Okay, so
you might say that I had a bias to come up with a certain result or something, whereas, these people aren't going to have any bias. I don't have an axe to grind, but some people might say that I do, and, whatever. So, but, they're just totally independent. Again, they've been given a sample and asked to run the standard analytical method and report the results.
To the audience, I say this, what we're talking about when we say a blind study is that those performing this test, they don't have any idea why they're even doing this test, or even what the dust is of, just that they're doing the results, and they don't have any clue what the circumstances are behind it, correct?
Right. They're going to put this chip, for instance, into a DFC, and they're going to take it from room temperature up to whatever temperature I tell them to go to, and it's probably going to be 600 or 700 degrees centigrade, depending on the test that's being run, and that's all they're going to know. They're going to take it from here to there at a certain rate, and then they're going to tell me, did heat come in or out, or nothing at all happened? And, that's it. The plan is to do it on, both, in essence, known positive chips, and then also ones on primer to show what those do. That work's been done before. I don't think it's actually been published, but this will wind up being put out into the public domain one way or another. So.
Now, I got a question, too, and I want you to address this, and I guess I'll give a little bit of background. People who listen to this show have probably heard this story a couple of times, but, as a volunteer for AE 9/11 Truth, I've gone to my congressman's office, and we've asked them to write a letter to National Institute of Standards and Technology, asking them to test their own dust samples and basically do the same kind of test that you've done and Stephen Jones has done for themselves. My congressman's office has refused to do so, no reason cited. NIST, of course, is not going, they don't want to do that, hence the reason that we had to go to the congressman's office. What do you say to that, and to NIST logic, if you're aware of it? You know, there are reasons of why they're not doing the tests on the dust samples. What would you have to say to NIST and to just the political leaders of America, on something like that, on testing the dust and why it's important?
Well, it's basically just to get to the bottom line and to learn the truth. The thing is, you're trying to convince people that there's a reason for them to look at it, and they think that there's every reason for them not to, that it's just a waste of their time, that the answers are already there. And so the real thing is getting them to open their eyes to even want to look. A lot of people, that's what I think it is. They just they can't see. They just can't see past what it is that they already see. And you can stand there and talk to them till you're blue in the face, but until they won't actually hear you, they're not going to hear you. A lot of people have, like you were saying earlier, that, more and more people's eyes are opening. But they have to open their own eyes. My experience in having, I won't say beat my head against the wall for the last 4 years, but sometimes you feel that way, is that there's no need to do that. You say your piece, but you're not going to convince somebody that doesn't want to be convinced. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't say something. You should still say what it is that you have to say, and you should still do what you have to do. But I don't expect anybody to change their mind based on what I say or do. What's going to change is when they change inside themselves and they allow themselves to start questioning and start seeing things that they weren't allowing themselves to see before.
Mark, you answered one of the questions, and you're kind of putting out the information that I was going to throw at you, and that is just that. On a more personal level, obviously, we've had a lot of other scientists and individuals that have worked very hard on this evidence. We've had Jonathan Cole here and others. And just that, is it more of a personal satisfaction that you're doing what you're supposed to do? Obviously, you've been doing this for many years, and as we can talk about here for another hour, about the complacency of Americans and just people everywhere, despite this obvious, reproducible scientific evidence, and how you've committed yourself to this lifestyle of to the truth and to the science and the evidence. And just seeing the complacency of the people, is it more just a personal satisfaction, feeling that you're doing what you're supposed to do then when you continue on with these experiments? I'm
just doing it because I think it's the right thing to do. Based on what I see, I just think that and it's not just 9/11, but, that's what we're talking about here. But there's a lot of problems, and if nobody does anything, it ain't going to get better on its own, from what I can see. It's only going to keep getting worse. So I do it just because I think it's the right thing to do. The bottom line.
We thank you so much, and I'm not just saying this because you're on the show now, but that I've seen your videos, your work, and that is apparent, and that is why this, like as you just said, we're just talking about 9/11 right now. There's a lot more going on out there, and the 9/11 truth movement and the science of it is very well grounded, because the individuals that have repeated these experiments and have shown us what was found in the dust, and those that have spent a lot of time on the physics. So we had Professor David Chandler on the show some time ago, and his work.
Actually, well, I'm glad you brought him up, because I would actually say I think it's a real. You talk about the videos, and there's actually a couple of them in particular, and I can't give you the names of those now, but I could provide them to you here shortly afterwards, like tomorrow or whatever. And I've noticed on your website that you provide links that you've referred to within the show and so on. So those could be posted up there. But he's done a couple of videos that are very good, where basically what he's showing is that one of them, he basically, most people are familiar with the collapse of the towers, the big towers and so on. But If you look closely at that, there's a lot of debris that was falling, was being, in essence, looked to have these big white plumes of smoke trailing behind them. Well, when traditional or any thermite, if it's an iron oxide and aluminum type thermite burns, it actually burns hot enough that it produces aluminum oxide smoke. It takes the aluminum oxide, which is what rubies and sapphires are made out of, and it produces that in liquid form, but it's actually hot enough that some of it turns to the gas form, and then as it condenses, it makes a white smoke. Well, anyway, what the point I'm getting at in his videos is, in one of them, what he's showing is that these particles are actually accelerating faster than the acceleration of gravity, and so there has to be some sort of an impulse that's occurring on them to produce this downward, in essence, thrust. You know, if something's just free-falling, there's no thrust. It's just free-falling. The gravity is going to cause it to accelerate and speed up. But if you were to take that same object that was just free-falling and speeding up, but now put a rocket engine on it, it's going to go even faster than what gravity would do. And he graphically shows how a number of these chips, or not chips, some of them are actually, I forget how big one of them was, it was like a whole section of a wall, was being accelerated through a thrust, an impulse. And his contention is that what we're actually seeing here is this nanothermite material producing an impulse of thrust to produce these things going faster than the acceleration of gravity downward. The other video that I think is even more compelling is there's a number of material, or a bunch of material, and a number of articles, whatever you want to call them, items, were kind of thrown horizontally out of the towers as well.
Right,
and ejected long distances. Well, in one of the videos, one of these large chunks is hurtling across the sky, you know, basically as you're looking at the video, from left to right, and all of a sudden, it makes a right-hand turn downward. And so, again, he basically tracks this thing, and he's saying that, you know, the things don't just make right-hand turns as they're free-flying through the air. There has to be something that took this massive steel beam and all of a sudden began to accelerate it, you know, rapidly downward towards the ground. And, again, there's this big white trail that comes off behind the thing. So I think David Chandler, some of his videos in particular, are very elucidating in terms of that, yeah, this material has the ability to produce a lot of work when it wants to, when it needs to, or when it's ignited and so on. So I would definitely refer people to David Chandler's videos, and specifically looking for ones that talk about accelerating objects.
Now, Mark, I got a question for you. And we've had another guest on the show named Graham McQueen, who has taken account from a number of different first responders, and there's also been video accounts of explosions taking place that day. Now, in terms of your work and what you've done in discovering the thermitic materials in the dust, because I've heard people say that thermite is silent as it does its work, as it does its damage. Could the thermite reactions have anything to do with the explosions taking place at Ground Zero on that morning?
Sure they could. Again, if you put it into contact with the right material, even like water can produce steam. Steam can produce an explosion. If I have it contained within a vessel that produces a certain amount of, in essence, like if I fill a steel pipe with gunpowder or water and I heat it up enough so that it, produces enough gas inside, it's going to cause that pipe to rupture and explode. But it's going to take a certain amount of internal pressure before that pipe is literally going to shatter. But when it does, it's going to make a report, right? That explosive noise. And so, yes, if it was properly contained, I think it could certainly give off a report.
So if I understand right, and I just want to make sure that I can understand it so our audience understands it, it's not even necessarily the thermite itself reacting, it's reacting to its environment. If it's contained within something, it's the explosion could be whatever is containing that thermite rupturing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. But I'm not saying that every explosion was thermite. It probably wasn't. I think that, there was probably a mix of things. things that were used. And I don't think all of the nanothermite was necessarily even of the same composition. I think there's indications that there were a few different types that were used.
Okay, well, we appreciate all that information. Of course, there's no way of knowing exactly all the materials they used, but we do know for sure what they did, some of the things they used, and I agree, the evidence is very clear.
There was a molybdenum microsphere that was found by the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey. I talked about how they went through the dust. They found the molybdenum microsphere. You can make thermite that basically uses, instead of iron oxide, uses molybdenum oxide, and then mix that with aluminum, and you'll get a thermitic reaction, and you'll produce, instead of molten iron, you'll produce molten molybdenum. Well, molten molybdenum is an even higher melting point than iron by a good amount. It's almost double the amount. So it's used like in refractory furnaces and so on because it's such a high temperature material. And but yet, molten molybdenum was found in the World Trade Center dust, too. I mean, it was solidified at that point. But so that's what I'm getting at, where I think there were a number of different materials used here. It wasn't really just necessarily one material.
You mentioned something in one of your videos about how there was a 1984 patent for a thermite cutter charge, and I don't really know much about that. Just briefly, in our last 10 minutes here, can you talk about that?
Well, you're familiar with Google. Okay, well, Google has a section that all has to do with patents. And so really, anybody that wants to go look up things to do with thermite and the ability to cut through steel and take down buildings really should just go to the Google patent section and do a search for thermite and building demolitions and so on. Put in a few keywords like that, cutter charges and so on, and you'll come up with many, many, many forms of material, practice instruments, in essence, that, are completely described. Because when you get a patent on something, you have to describe it in excruciating detail, what it is that makes yours different than everything else before it and why yours is new and ingenious and you should get a patent for it. But you basically have to disclose everything. And there's a number of them out there. There's many, many of them out there.
So it's basically, and what I'm trying to convey to the audience is that it's very, very possible, absolutely possible, that this was used to bring down the trade towers, and there's a number of ways that it could have been done.
Yeah, most of the ones that are described out there, the way they work is, when you were a kid, did you used to fly like Estes engines? That little rocket engine, what they design, what most of these cutter charges are, is in essence, it's kind of like that rocket engine, but instead it's filled with a mixture of thermite and, again, something that's going to produce gas. But what it winds up doing is it shoots liquid iron out of the rocket nozzle. Because all that gas that gets produced, there's molten iron that gets produced too, but the gas forces the liquid iron out the nozzle, and that nozzle would be pointed, say, for instance, at a steel beam, and its purpose is to just cut through it like a hot knife through butter.
Okay, well, that's a lot of information. Unfortunately, we are out of time for our audience. We've been speaking with Mark Basile, a chemical engineer who's a long time, for years now, working with the dust of the World Trade Center and proving over and over again what was found in the dust of the World Trade Center, active thermitic material. For those of you who have been listening, we ask our audience to go ahead and go to markbasile.org, and you can read on his independent study. He's raising money for a new independent blind study for those of you who are unfamiliar with what we've been talking about. We want to have a lab go over the evidence of not being aware of any particular purpose or goal or anything or any agenda behind the experiment, and let them do and just basically reproduce a lot of this evidence. Again, Mark, thank you for coming on. Hopefully, anything coming up for you in the near future, or anything else, any last thing you want to throw out for our audience?
No, I'm just working away slowly but surely here.
Okay, well, you've done a lot already, and we do appreciate all your work. You will be vindicated in all the work that you've done. That work will last forever, and generations will know about this work. So we can't thank you enough. Thank you for coming on. As for everyone else, Andy and everyone else, this is Bernie Suarez here with Andy Steele, and this is 9/11 Freefold. You can check us out at 911freefold.com. radio.com and our audience. You can listen to us every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern at nolineradio.org. That's about it. Take care, everybody. Goodbye and good night.